The sky didn't just darken that night. It collapsed. The kind of storm that makes even the oldest ranch dogs whimper under porches and rattles the bones of mountains carved by time. Lightning split the heavens open like a curse, and the wind screamed across the valley as if it were mourning something not yet lost. Trees cracked like ribs, and rivers rose with the fury of 1,000 buried prayers. Folks in the nearby town of Hollow Bend barred their doors and whispered psalms, knowing full well that in the West, when a storm like that rolls in, something's always taken. Miles out, nestled against the base of Black Elk Ridge, a loner named Ellis Boone sat by the fire in his one-room cabin, unaware that fate was riding that storm straight to his doorstep. He hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, not since he buried his last horse and hung up his hat on the world. But that night, as the wind clawed at the walls and firelight flickered against old timber, something called him outside. A sound, not of thunder, but of pain. Small, fragile, human. He found her collapsed near the creek, soaked to the skin pale beneath war paint now smeared by rain. A girl no older than 12, wrapped in a deerskin cloak torn and trailing behind her like a ghost. She didn't speak. She barely breathed, but her eyes, black as coal, wide with fear, locked onto his, and in that instant, Ellis Boone, a man who had sworn off the world, remembered what it felt like to be needed. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms and carried her back through the gale, shielding her tiny body with his own. The fire inside his cabin was dying, but he fed it with everything he had: wood, blankets, even the last pages of his journal. He placed her near the flames and wrapped her in the thickest wool he owned, whispering to her in the same voice he used to speak to ghosts. Low, steady, desperate. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a new kind of storm began, one that didn't tear down but rebuilt. With every breath she took, slower and steadier, Ellis felt something shift deep in the parts of himself he thought were long gone. By morning, the storm had moved on, leaving behind broken trees, flooded roads, and one small miracle. The girl still slept, her tiny hand resting near the fire that had saved her. And Ellis, once a man with no reason to wake at dawn, now watched the sunrise with something like purpose. He didn't know where she came from. He didn't know why fate had chosen his cabin when there were 100 other places she could have died. But he knew this. Sometimes the West doesn't give you a second chance. It gives you a reason to become one. The storm may have passed, but its ghost lingered in Ellis Boone's cabin. The floorboards were still damp, and the roof hissed with the slow drip of rainwater falling from broken shingles. Yet inside it was warm. The fire, though reduced to embers, glowed with a quiet strength. And near it, the girl lay wrapped in wool, her breathing even now no longer a gasp, but a rhythm. Ellis watched her in silence, crouched beside the fire like a man unsure if he was guarding her, or guarding himself from what came next. When she finally stirred, her first instinct was to flinch, hands drawn close, eyes darting to corners. But Ellis didn't move. He just tilted the pot hanging over the fire and poured her a cup of warm broth. She sniffed it, hesitated, then drank. No words passed between them. None were needed. In the West, trust wasn't given. It was earned one quiet gesture at a time. And for that moment, the fire was enough. She leaned closer to it, her small frame still shaking, not from cold, but from memory. Ellis had seen that kind of trembling before. Not in the war, not in men, but in the eyes of an orphaned colt he once found, covered in mud and broken ribs, still alive only because it refused to lie down. He never kept the colt. It ran off as soon as it could walk, but he remembered how it looked at him just before it vanished. The girl had the same stare, wild, wounded but alive, and something in him, some part buried deep beneath scars and silence, refused to let her vanish too. He gathered bits of her story without asking. The torn beadwork on her dress spoke of the Oglala. The cuts on her hands said she'd been running through thorn brush. And the way she flinched when the wind blew too hard told him the storm wasn't the only thing that had chased her. He didn't press. He simply fixed the roof, warmed more stew, and made sure the fire never died. In the stillness, she began to draw, first with charcoal on old bark, then with paint made from crushed berries and ash. She painted fire, again and again, flames rising, Flames protecting. Flames reaching. And as the pictures took shape, Ellis realized this wasn't just memory. It was something deeper. To her, that fire hadn't just kept her alive. It chose her. And by extension, so had he. By the third morning, the girl finally spoke. Her voice came rough and uncertain, like it had forgotten how to exist in the world. Niwa, she said softly, pointing to the fire. Ellis, unfamiliar with the Lakota tongue, nodded anyway. He could feel what she meant. Warmth, spirit, life. Her name, she later told him, was Wachapi, Star. A name carried like a whisper through the trees, fragile and eternal. From that moment, she spoke more each day, always soft, always brief. But with each word, her presence became louder than the wind outside. Ellis taught her how to chop wood, how to boil water without burning it, how to braid rope tight enough to hold saddle. In return, she showed him how to mark the trees that held medicine, how to listen for snow and the birds' calls, and how to hum the song of safety, the one her grandmother had once sung beside a campfire. Two people, born from opposite sides of history, now shared the same rhythm, not as rescuer and rescued, but as something more sacred in the West, companions by necessity, allies by choice. But peace never lasted long in the frontier. One afternoon, as Ellis was gathering traps near the edge of the ridge, he saw smoke rising where it shouldn't. A thin trail, black and bitter, curling up from the pine line. Raiders. Or worse, vigilantes. Folks who didn't ask questions when they saw a native child with a white man. Folks who'd rather finish the work the storm didn't. Ellis's heart beat slow and deep, like war drums. He knew the ways of men who carried torches and knives sharper than their judgment. He returned to the cabin before sundown, quiet as a shadow. Wachapi sensed it. Her eyes sharpened, hands steady. They're close, she whispered. Ellis nodded. Too close. He didn't speak out of panic. He had lived through worse. But he also knew that one misstep, one misread moment, and the fire that had once saved her could now become the thing that consumed them both. That night, he sat by the flames with his rifle across his knees, listening not to footsteps, but to silence. Waiting. Wachapi didn't ask what they would do. She simply laid a new painting at his feet. It showed a lone cabin surrounded by storm. But at the center, unchanged, unbroken, burned a fire. Beneath it, she had drawn a single figure with a shadow cast not behind him, but ahead. Ellis looked down, then met her gaze. The fire hadn't just kept her alive. It had made him remember what it was to be alive. And now, it would have to keep them both that way. The men came at dawn, not on horseback like cowboys in stories, but on foot, cloaked in frost and fog, their shapes barely visible through the morning mist. There were 4 of them, strangers to Ellis, though their kind needed no names. They carried muskets and machetes, and the look in their eyes wasn't curiosity, it was hunger, the kind that fed on fear. We heard a squaw came this way. One of them called, standing just beyond the gate. You seen her? Ellis stepped forward without hesitation, his rifle slung low but ready. No one here but ghosts, he replied. They didn't take kindly to defiance. One moved to circle the cabin, while another reached for his blade. But Ellis didn't flinch. He'd seen men try to use fear like currency before, and he knew the exact moment when it stopped buying them anything. You should turn back, he said, his voice low like the wind before lightning strikes. This land's not what it used to be. And it wasn't. Because inside that cabin was more than a child and a fire. It was a sanctuary forged in silence, and guarded by a man who had finally remembered how to protect. Just as one of them took another step forward, Wachapi emerged. She didn't run, didn't hide. She walked to the edge of the porch with something clutched in her hand. A piece of bark, charred and etched with symbols none of the men understood. She dropped it to the ground, and the fire from inside caught it instantly. Flames rose, not high, not wild, but controlled, strong, precise. It wasn't a threat. It was a message. The girl they sought wasn't theirs to claim. She had already been claimed by the fire, by the land, by the man beside her. Something in that moment cracked the confidence of the intruders. One turned to spit, but another pulled at his coat. Let's go, he muttered. Ain't worth it. And like shadows unworthy of the light, they melted back into the trees. Ellis didn't move until they were gone. Only then did he exhale. Wachapi looked up at him, not with fear, but with the quiet pride of someone who had faced fire before and now knew how to control it. That day, the fire inside the cabin wasn't just warmth. It was protection, memory, and defiance. It reminded Ellis of something he had once heard from an old tracker years ago. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard in the West. You just need to keep your fire burning. He understood that now. Wichapi had survived not because he saved her, but because he chose not to let her be forgotten. And in return, she had taught him how to be remembered for something more than his silence. Winter crept deeper into the valley, blanketing the land in white stillness. Snow piled along the windowsills, muffling the world outside. Yet inside the cabin, the fire never died. It became a ritual, a rhythm. Ellis gathered kindling each morning. Wichapi fed it dried sage and pine resin each night. It was their heartbeat, pulsing against the cold. Sometimes they sat for hours without speaking, letting the fire do the talking. And in that glow, they found something more powerful than words: trust. With the threat behind them and the season locking the world down, Ellis began carving again. Not just tools or handles, but figures. He whittled small animals from pine and birch, setting them on the mantelpiece. One day, he carved a coyote with eyes too knowing for its size. Wichapi took it and painted a small star on its back. "For the spirit that runs alone," she said. Ellis didn't ask her to explain. He didn't need to. He was that spirit, and now so was she. But even as the days passed quietly, Ellis couldn't shake a feeling, like the land itself was holding its breath. Something was coming. Not men. Not winter. Something older. Wichapi felt it too. Her drawings changed. Less fire. More sky. More shadows. She said little, but he noticed the way she glanced west each evening, as if waiting for something, or someone. She had remembered her past, he realized, but had not yet made peace with it. One evening, as the fire crackled low and snow tapped against the roof, she told him. Her village had been scattered. Some taken. Some lost. But she had seen her brother run north, past the river bend where birches grew in clusters of 13. He might still be out there, she whispered. Ellis nodded, knowing what the next chapter would require. The cabin had been a refuge. A beginning. But no fire burns in one place forever. Eventually, it must move or be extinguished. They began preparing quietly, packing furs, drying meat, mapping the ridge. Ellis didn't ask why he was going. He already knew. Because a man who once saved a girl from a storm now followed her into one. Not out of debt, but out of something deeper. Something the Old West rarely offered, and even more rarely allowed to endure. Purpose reborn through the courage of another. The morning they left, the valley was wrapped in fog. No sun, no sound, just a pale hush that blanketed every tree and stone. Ellis stood at the doorway of the cabin one last time, his pack heavy and rifle slung low. Wichapi placed her hand on the wooden frame, whispering something in her native tongue. Words Ellis didn't understand, but felt settled deep in his bones. They didn't say goodbye. The fire inside was left burning, low and steady. A promise to return. Or maybe just a reminder. This place had mattered. Their journey was slow, deliberate. The path wound through frozen creeks, over sharp ridges, and past trails only Wichapi seemed to know. She walked with quiet certainty, every step guided by memory. Ellis followed, steady and protective, always scanning the horizon. They passed signs, animal tracks, broken branches, a ribbon of red tied to a pine. Each clue drew her closer to something, perhaps her past, perhaps hope. For Ellis, it wasn't about the destination anymore. It was about making sure she got there with both feet and her spirit intact. One night, as they camped beneath a cliffside, Wichapi began to sing. The song was soft and sorrowful, echoing through the dark like wind whispering through tall grass. Ellis didn't speak. He just listened, understanding that some grief only knows the language of melody. When the fire crackled low, she looked up and said, "My brother's name is Maddo. He's strong, but not enough to fight the cold alone." Ellis nodded. Then we find him. And that was all that needed to be said. Days blurred into one another. Hunger pressed close, and the wind grew teeth. But they didn't turn back. Ellis kept them moving, hunting when needed, building shelter where none existed. He taught Wichapi how to spot danger in the stillness. She taught him how to read the snow, how to listen to birds when the ground said nothing. Their survival became less about luck and more about balance. His fire, her instinct, his silence, her vision. Together, they carved a trail into land that didn't welcome strangers. And then, on the edge of the 13th birch grove, they found footprints. Not animal, not theirs. Human, small, deep, leading toward a narrow canyon. Wachapi crouched beside them, touched the snow, and smiled for the first time in days. "Maddo," she whispered. Ellis looked ahead, heart tight in his chest. The storm that had once brought her to his doorstep had now brought them here. Not to escape the past, but to reclaim what it had tried to steal. And the fire they carried between them, it was stronger than ever. The canyon narrowed, and the wind sharpened. As they moved deeper, the world seemed to close in, steep walls of stone pressing like ribs around a heart. The tracks grew fresher, closer. Then they heard it, a faint cough echoing against the rock, followed by a hushed voice calling a name. Not hers, not his, but something between. Wachapi's breath caught in her throat. She broke into a run, snow crunching beneath her feet like thunder in the quiet. Ellis followed, rifle ready, eyes scanning the edges for danger. This place felt sacred, or haunted, maybe both. At the far end of the canyon, they found him. Maddo, wrapped in hides, thin as a shadow, huddled beneath an outcropping of stone. His face lit up the moment he saw her, eyes wide, disbelief flickering into recognition. He tried to stand, but collapsed. Wachapi dropped beside him, cradling his face with both hands, whispering in Lakota faster than Ellis could follow. It was reunion. It was relief. It was the sound of a heart mending after too long in the dark. Ellis didn't speak. He just knelt beside them and began building a fire. The kind he knew. The kind that didn't need words to work. Flint, kindling, steady breath. When the first flames caught, they bathed the canyon wall in gold, casting long shadows behind them. 3 shapes, connected not by blood, but by survival. Wachapi fed Maddo water and strips of jerky, humming softly the same lullaby her grandmother had sung. And for the first time in weeks, the cold seemed to step back. They stayed there for 2 nights. On the second, Maddo began to speak. Slowly, broken words. He told them how he had escaped the raid, how he'd hidden when others were taken, how he'd been too afraid to go back. "I thought I was the last," he whispered. Wachapi shook her head, her voice clear. "We are not the last. We are the ones who remembered." Ellis stared into the fire, letting the meaning of that settle like snow on his shoulders. When they finally left the canyon, Maddo walked between them, leaning on Ellis with one arm, holding his sister's hand with the other. They moved slow but steady. Together, they would return to the cabin. Together, they would rebuild more than walls. They would rebuild belonging. And though the land would always be wild, always be cruel, there would be one place, marked by fire, marked by choice, where 2 children and 1 quiet man prove that storms don't just destroy. Sometimes they deliver. The journey back was slower, burdened not by fear this time, but by care. Every step was deliberate, as if the ground beneath them remembered everything they had endured. Ellis cut a path through snow-laden trees, breaking the trail so Wachapi and Maddo could follow. He moved like a man with purpose now, not just to protect, but to preserve, because what they carried between them was fragile and precious, not just survival, but healing. At night, when the fire was lit and the stars unveiled themselves, they began to speak of home, not the one behind them, lost to raiders and winter, but the one they would return to. The cabin, the field where the sage had grown. The painted bark still hung near the hearth. Wachapi whispered plans to Maddo as they fell asleep, where she would plant the new herbs, which tree could be carved for a flute. And Ellis, he listened quietly, learning the shape of their hope through their dreams. Maddo, though weak, began to recover. Each morning, he stood a little taller, walked a little farther, asked a little more. He and Ellis shared long silences by the fire, neither pressing for talk, both knowing that the bond between men isn't always forged in words, but in the shared task of carrying something heavier than themselves. Trust, memory, the burden of having lived when others did not. And somehow, Ellis felt younger by the day. not in body, but in the way his soul no longer creaked beneath the weight of loneliness. As they neared the valley, the wind softened. The trees no longer groaned under ice. The sun pushed longer across the sky, and Whichapi smiled at the way the earth welcomed them back, as if the land itself remembered. When they reached the ridge overlooking the cabin, it stood just as they left it, smoke rising, door shut, fire still burning low. Ellis had taught her to bank the flames so they'd survive. She had done the rest. And as the three of them stepped back into that quiet home, something unspoken settled between them. They were no longer running, no longer hiding. The fire had led them out and brought them back, not as lost pieces, but as a family stitched together by storm, silence, and the simple, defiant act of staying when everything told them to flee. That spring, the valley bloomed in ways Ellis had never seen. Wildflowers reached farther, bees returned in thick swarms, and the creek behind the cabin sang louder than ever. It wasn't magic. It was the work of hands, of Whichapi planting, of Maddo gathering stones for garden walls, of Ellis chopping wood with a rhythm that finally felt like life, not survival. The cabin, once a place of retreat, had become a beginning, and the fire inside burned not just to warm, but to welcome. Word of them spread slowly, as stories do in the West. Travelers passed through, some seeking shelter, others just curious. They left with more than food. They left with the tale of a man who lit a fire in the worst of storms, and the children that flame chose to save. Some didn't believe it. Others did. But those who saw the marks on the bark, the carved coyote with a star on its back, and the painted walls inside the cabin, they knew. Ellis never asked to be remembered, but the land remembered for him. Every time a hawk circled over the ridge, or the wind whispered through the trees in just the right tone, something told the story again. Not loud, not boastful, but steady like the fire itself. He had been alone once, forgotten, buried in his own silence. But now, every footstep on that porch was an echo of the choice he made to open the door that night, and the promise that came after. Maddo began building his own tools, carving his own path, but never strayed too far. Whichapi kept painting, each work bolder than the last, stories told in color, in symbol, in shadow. And Ellis watched them, day by day, becoming what the West rarely gave anyone the time to become. Whole. Not untouched by pain, but not owned by it, either. And that was the real miracle the storm left behind. So the fire stayed lit. Through summer storms, through the wind of harvest, through the frost that would inevitably return. But this time, when the storms came, they wouldn't find a man alone in a cabin. They would find a home full of light, of memory, of love earned through suffering and stubbornness. And no matter how wild the wind howled, one thing was certain: the fire would never die again. The seasons rolled on like slow thunder. Summer faded into gold, then gave way to the sharp edge of autumn. Leaves scattered across the porch, and the first hints of frost crept into the corners of windows. But inside that small cabin, the warmth never left. It wasn't just in the fire, it was in the rhythm they had built together. Ellis, Whichapi, and Maddo had become something unshakable, not just a household, but a living memory of survival turned into sanctuary. Each of them had changed. Maddo, once frail and fearful, had grown strong and quick, his laughter echoing through the pines as he raced traps and climbed trees. Whichapi, always quiet and watchful, now spoke with clarity and conviction. She had begun teaching the language of her people to Ellis, word by word, carving the syllables into bark and stone so they'd never be forgotten again. And Ellis, he had softened in the way only men who've made peace with their ghosts ever do. Not weaker, just open. Other children began to visit. Families from the edge of the territory brought their little ones to the cabin for medicine, for stories, for safety. Whichapi taught them to mix herbs, to read clouds, to listen to what the earth whispered when no one else was around. Ellis repaired boots, saddles, tools, never charging a cent. Instead, he asked only one thing: listen well. Because in the West, knowledge wasn't just survival. It was the thread that held memory together. One night, as frost laced the grass and the sky burned with stars, Whichapi stood outside the cabin and stared into the dark. "That night in the storm," she said softly, "I think I died." Ellis stood beside her. "And what are you now?" She turned to him, eyes steady. "Something new." He nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. The storm hadn't just torn through the valley. It had ended one story and started another. And though none of them said it, they all knew storms would come again. Not just wind and rain, but people lost, silence. But now they had a place that would not fold, a fire that would not be put out. And when the next soul came knocking in the middle of a storm, cold, lost, forgotten, there would be hands to pull them inside. Because Ellis Boone had once answered that call, and from it, a family was born. Years passed like pages in a book written by the wind. The cabin aged, but never crumbled. The fire flickered, but never failed. And the story of the storm, the girl, the fire, the man, spread beyond the valley, beyond the ridges, carried by travelers and told by those who had once come seeking shelter and left with something far more lasting: hope. Ellis grew old. His hair turned white, his steps slower, but his hands remained steady, always near the flame. Maddo became a man, tall and fierce, known for his loyalty, feared for his silence. Wichapi became legend, a healer, a storyteller, a protector. The children she taught went on to teach others, and her symbols found their way onto doors, drums, and even the skin of those who wanted to carry her story etched into their flesh. On the night Ellis passed, the wind was quiet. Wichapi sat by his side, holding the same hand that once reached for her through thunder and rain. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His final breath came with peace, not pain, because he had not only saved a life, he had lived a second one through her. Maddo buried him on a ridge facing west, where the sunset always lingered a little longer, and beneath the headstone, they carved only 3 words. He kept the fire. Wichapi lit a torch from the hearth and walked alone into the woods. She planted it in the ground near the creek where he first found her. The flame danced, strong and steady, refusing to bow to the wind. And as she walked back toward the home they had built, she knew this. Some men live and die without ever being seen. But Ellis Boone had been seen, heard, felt. His story, born in silence, had become a flame that would light the way for generations. And still today, somewhere in the valleys of the old frontier, when storms howl and trees bend, and a child huddles beneath the dark sky, they say the wind carries a promise, that no matter how fierce the storm may seem, there's always a fire burning somewhere. You just have to survive long enough to reach it. In the unforgiving silence of the frontier, where storms could level trees and loneliness could level men, Ellis Boone lit a fire that became more than warmth. It became a symbol. It stood through wind and fear, not because it was large or powerful, but because it was steady. That fire saved a life, rebuilt another, and transformed a forgotten cabin into a sanctuary of memory and meaning. And in the quiet flicker of that flame, we're reminded that sometimes the smallest acts carry the heaviest echoes. Wichapi's journey was never just about survival. It was about becoming whole again in a world that tried to shatter her. What she and Ellis built wasn't just a home, but a legacy, a reminder that in a land where many were silenced, someone chose to listen. That when most would have turned away, one man chose to stay. And from that choice came something stronger than blood, belonging. Something that can't be claimed by force, only offered and earned. There are storms we all walk through. Some howl outside our windows. Others settle deep inside our chest. But the lesson buried in this story, like embers beneath ash, is simple. No storm lasts forever. And if you are lucky, if you're brave, you just might find someone who lights a fire and waits for you to reach it. Or perhaps, one day, you'll be the one who lights it for someone else. So carry this story with you. Not because it's about cowboys or cabins, but because it's about the choices that define us. It's about what we do when no one is watching, when it would be easier to look away, and how a single act of mercy can ripple into something immortal. The West may be gone, but its truths remain. Courage is quiet, kindness is defiant, and the strongest fire is the one that never asks for thanks. If this story touched you, if it sparked something in your memory or your heart, stay close to this circle. Subscribe, share your thoughts below, and let others hear this firelight tale. Because somewhere out there, someone is walking through their storm, and your voice, your presence, might be the light they've been searching for.